Okay, so we are going to start a new era of art history called Mannerism. Mannerism lasts for about 60 years, starts in about 1520, and ends at about 1580. The era was actually named by art historians. It was given to this group of artists that came after Leonardo da Vinci, after Raphael and Michelangelo. And it's a term that I don't want to say it's derogatory, it's not, but it's a term that sort of sets apart these artists from the Raphaelites. We don't really know what caused the era to emerge. Usually, when a new era of art history comes through, it's a reaction to something. It's a reaction to a political strife. It's a reaction to a new set of ideas or a new set of philosophies that come about within the world. And so there really wasn't something major that we see in terms of in the art, in terms of reaction to a certain thing. We do feel that it was a reaction to the great Renaissance artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. There is some theory that states that Mannerist artists were really at a loss for something unique to do because the Renaissance artists, the high Renaissance artists, were so prolific. They kind of had a hard time finding their own unique voice. And so because of that, they start a whole new dialogue, a whole new way of presenting visual imagery, and a whole new way of approaching art. So like I said, it might have been a reaction to the perfection of the Renaissance masters. It also might have been a reaction to the Catholic and Protestant conflict at the end of the Renaissance. We're just not sure. So what makes a Mannerist work Mannerist? For one thing, Mannerist works of art seem to have strange and unrealistic angles that cause the figures to have contorted body positions. They have unrealistic colors that tend to irritate the eye. We often describe the colors as being acidic. They tend to feel as if they vibrate off of the canvas. They don't really have a solid setting to them. If you look at an image that, if you look at a painting that is Mannerist, it tends to have some sense of ambiguity about where it's located. And we'll see quite a bit of those examples here in a moment. And the figures often seem to have an overly exaggerated emotional reaction. We'll see a few that are really over the top and a few that are just a bigger sense of emotion. This is Pontormo's Deposition. It's an altarpiece in the Capponi Chapel in the Church of Santa Felicia in Florence. The image itself is a deposition scene. That moment in time where they're taking Jesus off the cross and they're getting ready to lay him on the ground, where then everyone will lament over Jesus's body, and then he'll be buried in the tomb. You can see that the image has a framing that tends to make it feel as if it's as if the viewer is looking through a portal or a door. I believe that that was something that Pontormo intended, because soon the body will be laid to rest in a cave. Another thing that we talked about in terms of key features of Mannerist works is that they don't have a real setting. You can see that the setting isn't very defined. There's some clouds in the background. It's sort of grayish, but to exactly say where this scene takes place, other than to say it is a deposition scene, we really don't have any idea. The elaborate framing was something that was common. I would say more common in Northern European art, but definitely something that was common in art beginning at the Renaissance time all the way through the 1800s. The elaborate framing sometimes added to the value of the work because they were often gold gilded, or they often had some sort of intricate wood carving to them. This particular work of art also carries that heavily acidic looking color to the body. So let's go on to the next slide and you'll see a close-up and understand better what I mean. So if you're looking at the guy in the lower right that is standing on his tiptoes, by the way, you can see that his skin is a pink color. Its pinkishness is very unusual. He looks as if he's been baking in the sun for a week. The lady to his right wears a pink dress with yellow sleeves. Her pink dress is the same color as the back of his, or same color of his back. Only what you're looking at from this figure that's crouched down at the front is the skin of his back. So obviously that's not a real common color for skin. So we also said that Mannerist works have strange and unrealistic angles that cause the figures to feel contorted or to actually have contorted body positions. If we look closely at the figure that's supporting Jesus, the one that we just talked about, the bright red sunburn on his back, we also see that he's crouched down, kneeling on his tiptoes. That seems like such an odd stance because Jesus is at least a 250-pound man, and the person that's supporting him, most of his weight actually, is standing on his tiptoes, crouched in a crouched position. That doesn't seem very realistic. We see the person that holds the upper part of Jesus's torso also standing on the fronts of their feet. The front foot looks as if he stands on the ball of the front of his foot. The back foot supports no weight at all. We also said that they tend to not have a real setting. We talked about this in the first slide a bit, but you can see that other than the frame, we really don't get the idea that there is a setting here. We could assume that it takes place outside because we see a couple of clouds. But one of the things I often challenge my students to do with this painting is to create what we call a tableau vivant. A tableau vivant is something that basically actors act out the scene of the painting. And so they try very hard to recreate the painting using gesture and body position. And this one is always a very large challenge to recreate because mapping out where the people stand really seems quite tedious and inaccurate. It feels as if the people in the back are standing on some sort of step looking downward. We've even tried creating the tableau vivant on a set of stairs. It never seems to come out just like the painting because the people are positioned in the painting in a strange way. So what about that last claim that I made on the first slide that said the figures often seem to have an overly exaggerated emotional reaction? Do you see the emotion on the face of the character that holds the upper torso of Jesus? I have circled his head here on the left. He seems to have this face that shows the emotion of anger and anguish. It's sort of a haunting look in which he directs the emotion that he feels towards the viewer. If you look at the face of the figure that supports the lower portion of Jesus's body, the one that we've talked about, the sunburnt back and the standing on the tiptoes, it looks like he has a face of anguish or fear. Even the Madonna that we see standing behind the face on the left with the pink scarf around her head seems to radiate an emotion as she torques her head and looks out at the viewer. An emotion of anguish, an emotion of sorrow and fear, an emotion or a facial representation that we associate with worry. So one of the things that was popular through the elite society was the concept of the allegory. An allegory is a story, poem, or picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a moral or political one. A good example of an allegory would be the story of the tortoise and the hare. The tortoise is the slow and steady symbol of consistency. Slow and steady wins the race, whereas the hare is the one who's impatient and quick and not steady at all, and he loses the race. So it gives you an idea of what a metaphor, what an allegory is. How is an allegory different than a metaphor? A metaphor is a literary symbol that symbolizes something else. An allegory is a story or personification of a concept. An allegory has an extended narrative, whereas a metaphor is just one simple symbol. So Bronzino creates a painting called Allegory with Venus and Cupid. It is an allegory, and it has characters that convey emotion. They are characters that represent that emotion within the story. So your book doesn't really begin to classify Mannerist works of art until a few after the Palazzo del Te, but most art historians agree that the Palazzo del Te and Giulio, sorry, my Italian stinks, Romano's Fall of the Giant are Mannerist works. So we're going to add them to the Mannerist category in art history. Mannerism is a type of art that is really only appreciated by 1% of the population. Usually it's the 1% of the population that is part of the upper class of society. It's a witty and sometimes snobbish way of making art, and it was specifically for breaking the rules. So what do you think? Is this work of art a Mannerist or High Renaissance work of art? It's Mannerist. It's by an artist named Arcimboldo. He was an Italian artist responsible for spreading the Mannerist style throughout Europe. His work is sort of clever. It has a interesting way in which it approaches the imagery. If you turn the imagery upside down, you see a completely different image. It sort of has an intellectual play, and that's something that the intellectuals in that top 1% of society really liked about Mannerist style, is that it wasn't so straightforward. It wasn't quite so serene and peaceful. It was something that you had to look at. It was sort of a visual puzzle. It was something that was atypical, and that's what they liked about it. Arcimboldo was first and foremost an artist that painted still lifes, and you know that throughout the history of art, still lifes are a sort of staple in art. Well, the Mannerist artists decided that they wanted to take that staple and sort of flip it on its head, give it a new voice, look at the art in a different way. Here is one of Arcimboldo's still lifes. This is a fruit basket. It's from the 16th century, and if you look at it the way it is right now, it's just a plain old fruit basket. If you look at its inversion, you see that it is a portrait. Here is the top starts with a hat. The basket becomes a hat. The eyebrow area is defined by those two golden apples. The nose is a pear. The red bright apples are cheeks. So you get the idea. The idea is that they're breaking rules. One of the rules of still life is to produce the still life exactly the way it is sitting in front of you. In Renaissance work, they wanted everything to feel hyper real. And so this, while being hyper realistic, because you definitely know that you're looking at a three-dimensional apple there, it also sort of plays tricks with the imagery to create something that's a little bit more unique. We are moving on to Mannerist architecture. Mannerist architecture is a little bit different. Let's see if you can identify some of the rules that are being broken in this particular work of art. I wouldn't ask you to identify Mannerist architecture on a test, so that's an important thing to point out. But this is the Palazzo del Te, and it's an important building. It's in Mantua. It has Mannerist elements outside. In the courtyards on the inside, there's sort of an ingenious defiance of the old classic symbols and systems of architecture. In this image, you can see a little bit better the wonkiness of the building. I don't know if you noticed, but in the very first slide, I showed you the classical footprint of the building altogether. Excuse me. The building is really structured the way any classical Italian building is structured. It has a courtyard that was designed in the basilica style that goes all the way back to classical art traditions. So this is a Mannerist building. It follows the classical pattern just like most Renaissance buildings, or most Renaissance art has a throwback to classical antiquity, but it breaks the rules and adds a new voice in its architecture. If you look at the interior slides of the building, which is what you're looking at now, you can see some of the rules that the architecture or the artist is breaking. For example, in the top frieze, that's the area right below the roof line, you can see that the triglyphs and metope rotate between the 3 fluted lines and then an image, 3 fluted lines and then an image. That rotation of the 3 fluted lines and the image is something that the Greeks used. They invented it. It's a typical trait of a Doric building. However, the Mannerist architect moves the triglyph down about a foot. So, you know, you're going along the frieze and you've got the 3 lines and then the image, 3 flutes and then an image, and then all of a sudden he breaks the register and drops the triglyph down a bit. I'm going to circle that for you in the PowerPoint so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. If we were in the classroom, I would just point it out to you in the slide, but because we are not, I will draw it on the slide here in the next slide. But you can see that the columns don't stand completely outside of the building. They're engaged columns. They sit close to the building. There are niches. Some niches are deeper than others. Once again, that is all part of the fact that this is a Mannerist building. It's a building that was created to break the rules a little bit and sort of have fun with the classical elements of architecture. Okay, so here you can see that I've drawn a circle around that metope that seems to drop every so many spaces. If you look at that part of the frieze, you'll also see that it doesn't do it at a regular interval. In some places there are 5 or more metopes between the dropped triglyph. This work of art. So Bronzino was a pupil of Pontormo. His full name was Angola de Cosimo. He was a painter to the Grand Duke of Tuscany. This particular painting was a gift to King Francis I from the Grand Duke of Tuscany. And it demonstrates the elite's fondness of allegory as a tool of storytelling, and it's a complicated allegory. It's not as straightforward as one would naturally think of. Here you see an incestuous relationship that takes place between Venus and Cupid. Venus is Cupid's mother. And you can see the allegory unfold as Time, who is the bald man in the upper right-hand corner, sort of pulls away the curtain and reveals the incestuous relationship. Standing next to Venus and Cupid is Folly. Folly has rose petals in his hand and is a child. He's getting ready to throw the rose petals at Venus and Cupid in a fun, whimsical way. He steps towards them, and if you look at his foot that steps closest to Venus and Cupid, you will see that he has a viper's tail wrapped around the ankle of his foot. That viper belongs to Treachery, the young girl who has the face of a child and the body of a serpent. She's wearing a jacket of sorts. Then, if you go to the upper left-hand corner of the painting, you see Envy, who's looking on at the relationship with Desire. Below Envy, behind Cupid, you see a man who's gripping his head. I will show you a close-up of the man gripping his head here in a moment. But he is the point that, or he is, if you remember originally when we were talking about Mannerist works of art, I explained that a Mannerist work of art tends to have an overly emotional reaction from the characters. He is that overly emotional reaction in Bronzino's painting. At the feet of Venus, you see two masks that lay on the floor. The masks demonstrate sorry, I just want to look it up to make sure that I am right. Oh, I'm sorry. The masks demonstrate deceit. And so they are a common symbol in Mannerist paintings for deceit. So you can see how the story sort of unfolds, that Father Time reveals all, that there are symbols throughout the painting of the negativity of the incestuous relationship. Remember that 1% of society really appreciates this type of art. It's considered highly sophisticated and more elite because it uses things like allegory and hidden symbols to communicate a moral story. It's looked upon as being clever. Clever in that the viewer has to somewhat decipher what they're seeing in order to infer meaning within the work of art. This is a close-up of a figure that is in the background. It's a testament to the idea that we talked about earlier, where emotion is overly exaggerated in Mannerist works of art. I think that this is the emotion of disbelief and horror of the situation. Bronzino was also famous for his portraits. This particular portrait was done for the Medicis. He carefully renders the costume and creates a setting that has a haughty feel to it. When the viewer looks at the portrait, they feel as if they're being looked down upon by the sitter. We know that the young man is educated because he holds a book in his hand, and we know that he is upper class because his clothing is rich and made of fine fabrics. We get an unsettling look when we look at this painting because of the sort of unnatural way that the pupils look at the viewer. One looks directly at the viewer and the other one looks off to the side. That's not really common in the way that we render eyes. The background of the portrait feels somewhat wonky. There's a door behind him that meets a half wall, which centers our eye on the actual subject itself. However, in real life, this space doesn't seem possible based on the fact that there's a half wall in front of another wall, which recedes into space. So Bronzino's creating an architectural support or an architectural framework in which he drops in the portrait of the young man. That architectural framework seems somewhat unrealistic, but it does help us center our eyes on the subject or the figure that Bronzino is painting. So this work of art is by